So this webinar, Unpacking Power, Privilege, and Oppression, as we shared before, is the prerequisite, the foundation, starting off place for the Embrace online course and community. And I'm Malia Dunn. I use she, her pronouns. I am coming to you from what is currently known as Phoenix, Arizona, but is the indigenous and I live on the unceded lands, right, of the Akimel O'odham, the Hohokam, and other O'odham nations. And when I think about that history, when I think about what I know and what I don't know about the history of this land and the experiences and the place that I call home, I find myself getting curious about why that is. Why do I not know so much about this history? And so I invite you in your own ways, in your own spaces where you live, where you work, where you experience your life, to maybe have wonderings about the same thing. And as you see here, I had mentioned we've got several practitioners who have joined the Embrace course. We've got Tabari Coleman, Erin Beecham, Sharifa Rowe, Jason Sorois, Sarai Lopez, Natalie Thorson, and Jasmine Snipes, who are all going to be part of the course. And I'm just lucky and thrilled to have Natalie here today.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Natalie, she, they, he. I'm super delighted that y'all are able to join. It's nice to see some familiar faces and also maybe people that I don't know yet. I'm coming to you today from what is now known as Oakland, California, the unceded land of the Ohlone tribes and people. And my hope is that in considering privilege, if you do not happen to be an Indigenous person to the lands that you're on, that's one of the things that you're unpacking, right? Leaning into those different spaces. And it's definitely a different kind of work to unpack from that direction. Some of these things that we share today may be repeated. And I think that all of us, including Malia and myself, can always be doing more of really spotlighting in and focusing on areas of privilege and how we can leverage those to support folks. So really looking forward to it. What we are hoping from this process when it comes to anticipated outcomes, we're hoping that folks will gain a greater insight into oneself and one's roles in either colluding with or challenging oppression. And we name both of those things because I think we all want to challenge oppression, but we have to pay attention to how we are playing along with it and playing into it in order to consider how we can do more unpacking. We're going to get a very foundational understanding of basic language for the discourse of social change work. Examine privilege and common patterns associated with the dynamics of privilege and oppression, and then consider ongoing learning through the Embrace course and community for more effective social change and allyship.
Okay, so want to have some learning agreements for our participation today, but I often think that these kinds of concepts that we often share explicitly or name explicitly when we're in gatherings and we're learning or getting into dialogue about difference, I kind of think they're great practices just for life and how we might show up for others in life. But for today, and carry these with you wherever you so choose. But we hope that that you'll share authentically, even if your thoughts are still in draft mode. We're not looking for perfect. We are having grace and want people to be able to share, have curiosity about what's happening in you, what might be happening in others or within the group. So really noticing what's happening in your body, in your mind, if things are swirling, or like right now my palms are sweaty, but notice what's happening in you. Consider oops and ouch, right? Owning our impact. If there is something that is said or done that is brought to our attention as hurtful or harmful, owning that impact. And recognizing that, oops, we're all perpetual learners. And so in that learning, we want to offer grace to each other. We hope folks will demonstrate willingness to receive the stories that we'll be sharing today, and potentially what others when we move you into some pairs. And the encouragement to concentrate more if at first you are in disagreement with what might be shared. We invite you to understand that your truth is your truth. I would even say that your truth is not up for debate. Your truth is yours, and it's valid and real, as well as it's not a universal truth. So it might be different than mine or anyone else's that you may be interacting with. And P, practice empathy. This is what I think of, takes me back to when I used to watch the show Friends, and Phoebe sang a song that was lather, rinse, repeat, lather, rinse, repeat, lather, rinse, repeat as needed. And so that's when I think about this work. How do we practice empathy? We might screw up, circle back, clean it up, and try again and again and again, and just continuing that practice. And don't worry if things get messy. This slide is messy. They probably will. Don't worry if you don't feel closure. This work is ongoing, and certainly within 90 minutes, we won't have wrapped up all of the unpacking that there is to do and with power, privilege, and oppression. If technology goes haywire, if perhaps the person sent you a link that was the wrong link, it's an unpredictable world. And also, please don't worry, because we are all perpetual works in progress and growing, and we're in it together. So if you want to take a nice deep breath, sink into these learning and life agreements.
Thank you all for those intros. It made me feel lots of love, as does bell hooks. So one of the things that we're really hoping to center with this program is love, and using love as the practice of freedom. Without an ethic of love shaping the direction of our political visions and our radical aspirations, we are often seduced into continued allegiance to systems of domination. I conclude that many of us are motivated to move against domination solely when we feel our self-interest directly threatened. Often then the longing is not for a collective transformation of society, but rather simply for an end to what we feel is hurting us. Until we are all able to accept the interlocking, interdependent nature of systems of domination and recognize specific ways each system is maintained, we will continue to act in ways that undermine our individual quest for freedom and our collective liberation struggle. If there was ever a call in for people to center their privilege in support of people around them who don't have it, for me, this is that, right? If we're only thinking about our own traumas and harm, we're going to keep perpetuating the system. We're going to keep feeding into a system of domination. And if we want that transformation, we truly do need to work on that real strong lean into unpacking how we're perpetuating things and how we're part of the problem, even though we don't want to be, right? It's crappy. I don't know that anyone loves unpacking privilege. We can get good at it, though.
Mm-hmm. I've loved what happens after I
Okay.
privilege, right? I love where the process takes me if I don't necessarily love the process. So with that, we've got a question. What makes it hard to center love in this work?
I think a lot about, and I just had a recent experience that showed me how strong this is, but I think about the ways that we're disconnected from one another around identity. We're just sort of told that you don't belong with those people because you're not like those people, whatever that group is. And so we don't witness things. I am a person who is masculine of center, non-binary, it's something that doesn't fit the typical assigned female at birth femininity construct. And a close friend of mine that has so much love for me, we were just in an airport bathroom not long ago, and she witnessed me experiencing somebody come in and be sort of shocked in the bathroom, and like, you know, that impact on me. And I'm okay with it. I've experienced it so many times. I don't love it. But she broke down. She was crying because this was such an impactful thing, because she'd just never witnessed it, right? When we witness things, we know, right? So a piece of it is that we just don't have enough of that connection, which is tough, because I feel like love creates the connection, and then the connection creates love, right? So if it gets interrupted at either spot. But I think for me, that story was huge because it was deeply impactful, and I felt the love coming out of that moment. But without having witnessed that moment, I don't know if my friend would have ever really understood.
I think about shame, right? If we're from a place where I have a shame, or having a criteria of who is deserving of love. And if I really want to live in a liberated society where we are all connected, I have to mean all. So we've been naming privilege, we've been talking about privilege, but let's give it a definition to ensure that we're all on the same page. When we think about the language of privilege, and we were to just look it up right in Webster's, Wikipedia, right? Just the very basic language of it. As a noun, it's a right or immunity granted as a peculiar advantage or a right or immunity granted as a peculiar benefit, advantage, or favor. And as a verb, right, it is to grant higher value or superior position, right? To be able to grant that benefit, advantage, or favor. But when we bring the lens of equity, of social justice, we recognize that when we're talking about privilege, what we're talking about is this unearned social power accorded by the formal and informal institutions of society to all members of a dominant group. For example, white privilege, male privilege, etc. Privilege is usually invisible, or we could say privilege is usually unfelt, unrecognized to those who have it, because we're taught not to recognize it. Nevertheless, it puts those who have it in an advantage over those who don't. And in my journey, my lifelong journey, I tend to experience this awareness as something that comes and goes, right? I think about this sleep mask. When I'm asleep and not paying attention, not really into it, just kind of going, I have to actively work at recognizing where I have privilege and push the sleep mask back. I have to remove it. And it's kind of like, there are a handful of us, I can see you're wearing glasses. It's kind of like when you move your glasses to the top of your head, but then you end up like stretching them out over time, and you move your head just a little bit and they fall back down. That sleep mask, privilege, right? It'll fall back down when we're not continuously taking note, being intentional about tuning in to the unearned advantage. That sleep mask can return and come back. So I have found through my experience that it's this constant like pushing back again and be, oh, it slipped again. How can I be more aware? And I hope to get to a place where I'm just removing it from my head. I don't know if that'll happen in this lifetime. Thinking about the ways we're socialized and continue to get messages and have to filter through messages throughout our lifetime. But I see this as this kind of constant intentional interrogation, examination of how we are showing up. And with that, Natalie, privilege, right, we'll see is in the center of all of this.
Definitely. So in order, at least in my thinking and in my spaces, in order for us to fully understand what privilege is and how to work to unpack stuff, I think we have to make sure that we know some of the origins and the foundations of systemic oppression. You'll get more of the history through this in the Larger Embrace course, but there's so much history out there that reaffirms for me again and again and again, even when it's very hard to believe, that these things were created intentionally to serve a very few people. And most of us out there are suffering the impacts of it. And it's really easy when we think about privilege to be like, yes, it's the white man, right? It's not just the white man. Each of us is carrying some pieces of privilege with us. And there is a very wealthy elite who does tend to have multiple areas of privilege. So let's think a little bit about a couple of words. We've got a stereotype, right? And a stereotype is, on the most basic level, it's a belief about a group of people. We learn this from our friends, family, media, schools, other institutions. They can be positive or negative. A lot of times they're based on a grain of truth. So with those stereotypes, those come into our lives and our spaces literally from the time that we come into the world. And I mean, feel free to drop things in chat if you would like, or just think about, right, what are the first stereotypes that you remember learning? Who were they about? Who taught them to you? I got so many from watching Looney Tunes cartoons, right? Whew. I mean, cartoons still have some problems, but I'm 47 now. So back in that day, those cartoons they were really sad to look back. We learned stereotypes about who we were supposed to be based on our genitalia, right? Our masculinity and femininity based on the assigned sex at birth. And there are studies that show that baby boys are actually not held as close to the bottom as baby girls typically. That baby boys get a lot more eye contact than baby girls typically. That in spaces, and not as many places have nurseries that are set up like this anymore, but in spaces where they had nurseries where all the babies were together, when the baby girls would cry and the baby boys would cry, the girls were responded to more quickly. Right? It's like you're learning these little bits and pieces, and this might not be every single family, right? Maybe you had a family that was a little different, but if everyone around you is functioning in that system, it's still going to bleed over onto you. And that is the thing. We actually cannot escape the stereotypes we are learning because they're part of, and they are fed by these systems that hold privilege and social power in place. So prejudice, think about this for a second. Does anyone want to holler out, when you look at that word, what does prejudice mean? It's in the word. I see people mouthing it. I saw Gladys's mouth move. Prejudge. Angela put it in the chat there, right? To prejudge folks. And a stereotype is different than prejudice. A stereotype is sort of the large concept. That prejudgment is when we prejudge or have a feeling about someone based on the stereotypes that we know. They can be conscious, but most of the time they're unconscious because we don't have time. Not even we don't have time. Let me rephrase that. Most of the time they are unconscious because we haven't given the time and energy that we need to be working to unpack our stereotypes. And even if we were unpacking our stereotypes 24/7, we'd probably still have some unconscious prejudice. Stereotypes don't make you a bad person. Prejudice doesn't make you a bad person. I really believe that these are things that just exist and happen because of the fact that we're socialized into the world, right? A world where power systems are already at play. Discrimination, which also doesn't make you a bad person, is when people begin to be impacted by these systems. So discrimination is when we act on our prejudice. It can be conscious. Sometimes we consciously, intentionally discriminate against people, but a lot of times it is unconscious. By a raise of hands, how many of you have ever discriminated against someone? How many of you did that unintentionally? See, at the time, right? You didn't even realize, like, oh crap, I just did that thing. I treated someone differently because a feeling came up. There doesn't have to be any kind of a negative intention for a negative impact to occur with this. I put up my hand raise function by raising my hand. Let me lower that. There doesn't have to be any kind of a negative intention for a negative impact, right? And it can even be positively discriminating against someone, feeling an affinity for someone because of stereotypes. Oh, look, that girl in her junior year of high school named Natalie is really good at math. I'm a guidance counselor and I should help track her into math and science, where she will spend 3.5 years in college in a mechanical aerospace engineering program, because nobody ever asked Natalie what they wanted to actually really be doing. It was with a positive intent, but it was still something that wasn't looking at me as an individual. Right. And that's what discrimination does. We group people within these stereotype buckets. So here comes back to this central piece of privilege. Here it comes. Here we come back to the centerpiece of privilege. And social power is other language that I use for this. And it's access to resources that increase your chances of living a happy, healthy life. Doesn't mean that you are guaranteed happiness. Doesn't mean that you're guaranteed health. It's also the ability to control and influence culture. People who have a lot more class privilege, people who are wealthy, or people who are not colonized and who are in indigenous spaces, which is interesting. Both of those groups tend to live nice, long lives. Right? That's kind of weird. And then folks who are colonized, who maybe don't have that social power, not necessarily living as long and as happy of lives. The ability to influence and control culture, it means that people like you are in power. Does it mean that you share every single identity with those people? Definitely not. But if you can imagine in your head, all of the US presidents that you've known so far, if you happen to share an identity with them, it's an identity of privilege. Almost every single one has been white. Almost every single one has been wealthy. Almost every single one was born in the US, because only the first couple weren't. Right? Or maybe they actually were born in the US. We just weren't the US yet. Male, cisgender, heterosexually identified, able-bodied, adult, Christian. Right? As Bernie Sanders was running for the presidency, I can assure folks out there that some people out there, many people out there, probably didn't vote for him because he was a Jew. Nobody said anything about it because our country doesn't have religious oppression, by which I mean they do. Let me be really clear on that, right? That's privilege and social power. And then the last way that I consider it is it affords us safety. So when I think about leveraging my privilege in spaces, some of the spaces and places where I've been able to leverage it have been because I feel safe. As the Black Lives Matter movement was really launching, I went to a few rallies, and not to like be there and chant and rally, which is great. It's probably not my medium for getting things done, but I was there to protect people, because I knew that as a non-Black person in that space, if I were between police and Black folks, I would be safer. Right? I've been in a couple of spaces where somebody who is very feminine of center, female identified, is experiencing harassment. And I've been able, I'm also like 5'10", right? Because of the safety I have in my gender presentation and my physical size, I've been able to physically move into that space because I knew I was safer than that woman was. Thinking about naming things and doing things around disability, right? And really supporting folks. If I'm out there really making a fuss about elevators working in public transit stations, I'm much more likely to be recognized and noticed. That's privilege. When privilege comes together with all of these other pieces, that's when we have oppression. Right? Oppression is discrimination plus social power, since discrimination is built on the other two, right? It's all of these things coming around. So, for example, young people can discriminate against adults. Of course they can. We can, every single one of us can discriminate, but adults don't have the social power to oppress adults. If you can't vote, if you can't legally sign a contract or open a bank account, if you can legally receive corporal punishment in your home, you ain't got the power to oppress the adults that are around. Right? People of color, we don't do reverse racism. We might do racial discrimination, but reverse racism, for me, when that ISM is on the end of a word, it means that there is a power component at play. This cycle chases its own tail, right? The systems of oppression and the privilege and social power lead back into the stereotypes. Sometimes folks are like, the system is broken, and I'm guessing many of you have sort of heard the thing or read the thing or noticed this thing, like, the system isn't broken. The system was meant for this. And in reality, if we can begin to center love and begin to recognize one another and begin to unpack our privilege together and across identity, we are more powerful than this system. But it's not going to stop on its own. It's simply not. Any questions on that cycle or anything folks want to add? Yeah.
No, so I just want to say, when you talk of young people, elder abuse happens also with young people. Yeah. So
thank you for bringing that one in. Same exact thing. So in the space of adult privilege, like, it goes from, teens, depending, like if you're a petite woman, etc., you might not have adult privilege until you're in your 20s. And then, and this is interesting because women lose their adult privilege sooner as well. So there's an interesting intersection there. But then when you hit that other end, again, we don't necessarily allow people to vote. Even if they're unsafe to drive, instead of like having a conversation, we take away their driving rights. Fiduciary or fiscal abuse is out of control, and physical abuse. So thank you for bringing in that other end. I would hate to not name both of those. And it's all part of a similar system where you don't have value. Right? If you can't produce things, if you can't be part of our capitalist system, then you don't have value. So I think the cycle can be really overwhelming. Education, definitely another one that's in I fold that into social class, and it deeply plays in. So one of the things with this cycle that a lot of people will ask me is like, well, what the heck do we do then? Right? Like, hey, self-perpetuating, here it goes. We're all just kind of screwed. There are places and spaces that we can challenge these things. So, and this is in and outside of our areas of privilege, but I think we tend to begin with looking at areas where we're oppressed and then move into areas of privilege to unpack. But beginning by challenging your stereotypes. Think about how you learn them, who you learn them from. Read books. We got so many library folks here. Yay, libraries. Read books that are written by folks who come from populations that aren't typically represented. Right? Make room to watch documentaries. Get to know actual human, real life people with real life hands out in the world or without real life hands. Right? Get to know people out there that are different than you. And that's what helps to break down those stereotypes. The prejudice, we can challenge our prejudice simply by slowing down. So this larger system that's not benefiting us is also running us really fast. It's making us hustle, right? Making money, doing the thing, trying to survive, trying to pay your bills. And it doesn't give us time to slow down. But the people who did the studies at the Harvard implicit bias testing found that if people just slow themselves down a bit before they go into an interaction, it doesn't mean that your prejudice goes away, but it becomes more conscious. You feel it come up, and then you can do something about it.
Mhm.
That's all we need. And then with the discrimination and the oppression, both of those, you tend to find out when you do those when you get feedback. Not 100% the case, but frequently the case that you do the thing and you don't realize it because we're good folks. I really believe that. I don't think people want to be harming folks around us. We wouldn't choose to oppress or discriminate folks. So when folks tell us, we try and make change. Unfortunately, at that point, the impact has already happened, right? I wish I could say that, hey, if you go through the Embrace course, you'll never discriminate against or oppress anyone again. That would be awesome if we could make that course next, Malia, and take that on the road. But by unpacking your privilege and social power, you can get a little bit more at the root of things that you do that are oppressive. And those tend to be the things that land the hardest. Right? If you think about, so some folks here may work with young folks or with disenfranchised or oppressed populations of various identities. When those people discriminate against you, I'm sure it doesn't feel great, but I think it's a little easier to shake it off. When somebody who has privilege and social power oppresses you, it's really hard hitting. Right? So by unpacking the privilege space, it gives us another tool. How do you unpack your privilege and social power? You come to the Embrace program.
Thanks for the plug.
I was waiting for that, Malia. I think Malia's going to show us a video.
Yeah, and this might be something that you've seen before, but it's about 3 minutes, and invite you to notice the range that this video offers us in thinking about oppression.
Oppression. It's a word that's often used as a blanket term, but there's actually a whole lot more to it. There are 4 interlocking aspects of oppression: ideological, institutional, interpersonal, and internalized. And it might seem like a small difference, but it's very important to be able to distinguish between each kind, because understanding oppression is the first step to fighting it. Let's start with the core at the heart of every form of oppression: ideology. Every system of oppression comes from the idea that one group is somehow better than another. Ideological oppression starts when the dominant group associates positive qualities with itself and negative qualities with the marginalized or othered group. Ideological oppression describes the deeply ingrained social root of inequality. It's the larger overarching idea that leads to the isms. For example, the idea that black people are dangerous is ideological racism. The idea that poor people are lazy is ideological classism. Ideological oppression leads to institutional oppression. Institutional oppression is the way that systems and institutions manifest the dominant ideology. Institutions control access, who is able to get to what and how. This includes legal rights, police practice, access to medical care and education, public policy, political power, and media representation. For example, when women make 2/3 of what men make, that's institutional sexism. When a building is constructed without wheelchair ramps, that's institutional ableism. All of this leads to interpersonal oppression. Interpersonal oppression is probably the easiest to recognize because it happens all around us. Interpersonal oppression is the way that people play out discrimination and violence on each other. It can take the form of microaggressions, jokes, stereotypes, and harassment. For example, when a student is bullied for being gay, it's interpersonal homophobia. When a Muslim person is told that they're a terrorist, it's interpersonal Islamophobia. And all those forces, ideological, institutional, and interpersonal, lead to internalized oppression. Internalized oppression is the way that people with marginalized identities internalize narratives of their own inferiority. It's what leads people to feel less than. This is the end goal of oppression. The oppressive party doesn't need to exert force any longer because the marginalized group is enacting oppression on itself to maintain the status quo. It's important to remember that it's never a marginalized person's fault that they feel internalized oppression. It's simply what happens when someone faces negative stereotypes, low expectations, and ongoing discrimination. So, for example, an immigrant feeling embarrassed about having an accent is internalized xenophobia. When a trans woman feels that they can never be a real woman, that's internalized transphobia. So, to review, the 4 I's of oppression are ideological, institutional, interpersonal, and internalized. Each of these types are interconnected and completely supported by the others. They can never exist on their own and can even be seen as a cycle. Now that you understand the different kinds of oppression, you're even more equipped to fight it. Don't forget that any effort to dismantle oppression should aim to address it at all 4 of these levels. Thanks for watching.
Yeah, Western State Center produces a lot of really great stuff. So we will provide that video as a link. I'll send out an email to folks afterward as well. And Natalie, I know there's something about this video that you're like, I want to go a little deeper, a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, the internalized oppression piece. I'm guessing that everyone here has heard the term internalized oppression. And if you haven't, that's cool too. But most often when we are introduced to that term or when people use that term, it's just like it was in the video, which is talking about how oppressed populations start to believe what they're told about them. Right? So internalized oppression as a whole, when people's life experiences are consistent over a period of time, either as targets of marginalization or as unearned advantage, they believe and make it part of their self-image, their internal view of themselves, the myths and misinformation that society communicates to them about their group. So internalized subordination, we're like, yes, if somebody keeps telling you that you're not as smart or that you can't drive or that you don't have value or that you are irresponsible, right? All of these different things that we tell different groups around being oppressed, we really start to believe it. And that is true. But it's really weird to me that we don't talk about the other end, because if we're believing this around our oppression, we're also believing that we're awesome around our privileged identities, because society is telling us you're very smart, you're very trustworthy, you're very capable, right? You can do all the things, you are likable, you are safe. All different kinds of identities again. Internalized dominance occurs when members of the advantage group accept and or take for granted their group's socially superior status, as well as the system of structural advantage and privilege for their identities and others who share this identity as normal and deserved. If we're not considering our internalized dominance, I don't know what we're doing. And it seems really out of balance, right? We're like, well, the oppressed people, right? Here we are unpacking our privilege, and we're like, those oppressed people, they should stop believing that they're not as good as. But here we are over here thinking that we're rock stars, which I'm sure we're all rock stars, but we've also got a ton of internalized dominance that we have to work to sort of dig through. So making sure that we recognize both sides of that, for me, is really, really important. And then I would also say, I put in the chat the ideological, institutional, interpersonal, and internalized. I think I love this video the most and want them to do a video just on ideology, because that's the root. I put them in the wrong order, right? But the way that they build it up, they put that ideology at the bottom of the triangle or the pyramid. That's what everything is based on. So as you are unpacking your internalized dominance or your internalized subordination or your stereotypes, a thing that you can ask yourself is, what function does this ideology serve? Because they don't ask that in the video. They say there are ideologies, but they were created to maintain something, right? Ideologies around racial identifications were very intentionally constructed for different racial identity groups as they were constructed. so that oppression would go more smoothly. Yeah, I could go on, but I know we're going to run out of time if I keep running my mouth.
Well, when you run your mouth, great things come out of it. So
Thanks.
I appreciate that. Yeah. So we want to think about oppression and then how it manifests. And there are patterns when we think about group identity, when we think about privileged group identity or marginalized group identity. So there are patterns that happen. So how does oppression manifest in privileged groups, right? There's greater access to power and resources, right? That ability to control and influence culture. There's a pattern of these are typically the folks who are making the rules, defining what is considered quote unquote normal or quote unquote right. And there's often this that folks are unaware of their privilege and less aware of the discriminatory treatment of marginalized groups. Kind of like Natalie says, you might be unaware until somebody says, let me give you some feedback on that. Or we hear, check your privilege, right? That there is a call in or a call out that brings that awareness forward. More often than not, folks in their privileged groups are given the benefit of the doubt. And this, a pattern that just eats in me is focusing on how far we've come. But look, but it's not like it was 400 years ago, in which some responses might be is it that different? But that focus on the progress, and more often than not in our privileged group identities, in the larger society, we experience belonging. When we think about marginalized groups, right, it's not entirely like complete opposite, but here there's less power and resources. And there is that expectation to assimilate, to go along, to get along to those rules that were created through those with privilege in privileged groups. People who experience marginalization are very aware of their oppression and are able to track those indignities and recognize just how significant they are. And while privileged identity folks are given the benefit of the doubt, maybe when, for example, when I, as a white person, bring up things around race, I might get a little more leeway in the workplace, where as a colleague of mine of color, if they say it, they might be punished, right? And it's that challenging of the status quo that is unacceptable and then marked as a difficult employee, right? It's all of the, we can think about the different stereotypes that would come from that. Right? When you experience marginalization, right, the focus isn't on how far we've come, although progress is great, and we're not finished, right? So there's the focus on how much further we have yet to go. And while folks who have marginalized identities can experience belonging, it's usually when sought out specific groups, as opposed to kind of in the larger society in a workplace. We'll see things like ERGs, right, that are opportunities to hopefully create belonging and create that experience of connection, but in a larger workplace, perhaps it doesn't feel as safe or connected. And when we move through these manifestations come forward in what essentially happens of denying each other's truths, denying the truths of people who are, marginalized identity, we saw, are very aware of their oppression and can track those daily indignities. But oftentimes, when those are shared, that truth, which we had said no one's truth is up for debate, that truth gets denied. So, for example, we often will deny or have experienced perfectly logical explanations. So, for example, an unexamined Christian privilege. So, after sharing once before with a director level staff, hey, you continue to make reference about how we're all excited for Christmas break. And I don't think everyone here celebrates Christmas and feels that same universal enthusiasm. And it kept happening. And so then when speaking to a supervisor, the supervisor says, oh, she's got so much on her plate right now with all of the year-end deadlines. I'm sure she didn't mean anything by it. This perfectly logical explanation. When we think about this, what about? Some yeah buts or what abouts. For example, engaging in a conversation about the refugee and immigrant crisis at the border. And a counter to that might be, well, what about those people who are experiencing homelessness here that are American citizens? Isn't class and poverty just as important? And in that moment, I would say it is important, but you just dodged, right? We're not saying it's not important, but you dodged what somebody trusted and was bringing to you. Here we've got, for example, a colleague who lives with chronic fatigue syndrome and other additional complications. And they're sharing about how dehumanized they felt at a particular doctor's office. And if I were to say, well, my friend Tara goes to that same office and she's never had that kind of experience. You're like, well, great. Good for Tara. How, can I live? Can I tell my story? This example, that kind of thing happens to me, my group too. So a Black mother maybe shares about her daughter being sent to in-school detention and her concerns about potential bias in the principal's office, where a white colleague might respond and say, I don't think it's bias. I know there are plenty of white students who get in detention too, right? Just a denial. Yeah, but so many yeah buts that could come. But an example might be you share with a neighbor a concern about some language they use that's transphobic or has transphobic undertones, and they become agitated of like, yeah, but I'm not transphobic. I have a grandchild who's trans and I love them with all my heart, which I believe, right? I believe you. And we can still do things that have transphobic undertones. You're overreacting, you're too sensitive. So a team member who's still 5 years away from retirement is sharing their frustration that they seem to get fewer client referrals, and they've been passed over recently from participating in professional development opportunities. And they say to their boss, like, I want to keep learning. I still have so much to offer. But their boss is like, you're overreacting. I think you're being too sensitive. That's not what's happening here. Here, I don't see it that way, and therefore it isn't true. Full disclosure, this next scenario is my own. So a couple is watching a documentary about the impact of sexism and patriarchy on men. And the woman opens up a conversation to her boyfriend about his thoughts. He says, the language of patriarchy is that all men are bad. And despite her attempts to reframe, he continues to dismiss the concern. It doesn't happen to me. So a colleague who's diagnosed on the autism spectrum asks for some support because they are feeling passed over for input in staff meetings. Another colleague responds, I'm often asked to give input. And before the meeting ends, there's always that time when I would say like, well, does anyone have anything else to add? So I think this is all in your head. And finally, maybe the one you've all been waiting for. It wasn't my intent. So perhaps you're called in privately by a friend for teasing them, even lovingly, about their accent at a recent group dinner. And they share that you they felt like you were minimizing the importance of their cultural background. Defensively, you rush into, but that wasn't my intent. You misunderstood me. I love your accent, right? You misunderstood me, not, oh, I had impact. So these are the many ways, and I know there are many more ways that what we deny other people's truth, often from spaces of our own privilege or spaces of discomfort, because as soon as something gets called into it, we go into these modes of guilt and shame and the I'm a bad person trap. So I love, Natalie, when you shared the cycle of oppression, that none of this makes you a bad person, right? None of this says you're a bad person. Yes.
We've all done so many of those things.
Yeah. And we do have, so when you see the like, all right, they're telling us all the ways that we denied truth. What do we do about it? I promise it's coming. But Natalie.
We have just dropped a ton of information. So if you could take a moment after hearing the things from that last slide, and Malia can even put that back up if you wanted to, like, why is it hard to unpack privilege? Why is it hard to stop doing these things? For you personally, I don't want you to talk about anyone else, but for you, we can give folks 35, 45 seconds.
I'm seeing having an in-depth understanding of the word, ego. I'm seeing my own typos in mine. Afraid of what I'll uncover, of all of the, all that I'll need to make up for. Having a safe space for the oopses. So we didn't promise the work wouldn't be hard. That's a great addition, Natalie. We didn't promise the work wouldn't be hard, but I think we can get better at it. And so our strategies is one, if we can stop denying and starting to embrace, if we can unpack our privilege and embrace its reality, embrace the responsibility that comes in the areas where we do hold that social privilege, where we might be able to make change, we can do so. So the Embrace course is made up of 7 primary modules based on these strategies. And as you'll see, each module has a different co-creator that is a partner. And then you'll have opportunities where you also hear from other voices within each module. But we think about, we need to examine our identity to understand how and where we hold privilege, and then make space for all of those emotions that arise. If we can make space, maybe we can start making room for the love to come in, but make space for what comes forward when we start to do this unpacking. I named fear in mine. And if I can actually get what's underneath that fear and really into the feelings and the emotions and understand them, I can start to push through them. And that's why we need to build resilience, build that muscle for discomfort, build resilience to stay in the work, stay in allyship, and also really staying in our own integrity. Then we'll have a module about rooting into practices of accountability, what that means for yourself, what that means in mutual accountability, community accountability, and strategies for accepting the reality of our impact, regardless of our intentions. So when we get that call in or that call out or that feedback that something that we've done is discriminatory, that we can, instead of rushing to that wasn't my intent, can hear it, accept that reality, and do better and learn and process. And then connect to build community within and across difference. So in that space, we look at, like, what is true community? Maybe we've gotten a flavor of some community in this call today, but to move through that privileged identity caucus groups, what that work is supposed to be, and then also how to connect again in comparison with identity-based affinity groups and come together in the work of solidarity. And then finally, a strategy to elevate those who are most impacted by the experience of oppression, right? We're using the language of elevate because it's an E, but it's also rightly centering the experience of those who experience most oppression. So if you'd like to go deeper, right, if you'd like to spend a few weeks of time on each of these strategies and develop some skills, identify some practices and tools for your toolbox, we'd invite you to join us for the Embrace course. And this QR code will get you to a page. It'll either take you to a page where you can sign up and say, like, as soon as it launches, we're looking to launch. Goal is May 15th. We've got a little bit more video editing and some rearranging of things to do, but the goal is May 15th, but definitely May to launch. And you would get an early bird pricing, early bird special, and an opportunity to kind of share that with others. When it launches, I am trusting we'll still have a lot more to learn, but I know one of the things that we will be offering is equity-based pricing. So a scale of if you can pay beyond what kind of the at cost is to pay into that, so that we can have a scholarship fund to create lower cost options for folks who may need access in that way, as well as kind of enterprise pricing. So pricing for organizations if you're buying Costco style in bulk, and figuring out what that might look like. So we know that there's learning to come through the process. But I am so very grateful to all of you for opting in today and attending. I hope that you found deep value in the conversations and the information that was shared. Surely some things to reflect on, maybe be in discussion. Those of you who are colleagues, maybe get together, lean into some discussion. What did this feel like for you? What are you still chewing on? But the conversation doesn't end here, even if the webinar does. We invite you to stay connected. I am so very grateful. 3-ish years ago, when I was like, I think I want to build an online course, the twists and turns that it's taken and the connections that have happened have been so exciting. And I'm delighted to work with you, Natalie, and everyone else. So if there's anything else that you want to share before we say goodbye.
I'm thankful that y'all showed up and it was really fun.
You are awesome, beautiful, brilliant people.
Much love, everybody.